What if your final words were not a grand pronouncement, but a simple apology to your executioner? What if your last breath was spent whispering the name of the king who had cast you aside? Could a queen's entire life, a reign filled with power and turmoil, truly be distilled into a few quiet syllables uttered at the very end? We often look at the lives of royals as grand tapestries, but their deaths were starkly human. Their last words pull back the curtain on the performance of monarchy, revealing the person underneath the crown just as it's about to be permanently removed. Number 19, did she really apologize for stepping on a toe? Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI did not consummate their marriage for 7 years. The pressure on them was immense. She had a private village, the Hameau de la Reine, built on the grounds of Versailles, where she could dress as a shepherdess and pretend to live a simple life. This cost an astronomical sum. During her sham trial, she was accused of horrific acts involving her own son, Louis Charles. The accusation was so vile that it actually backfired, generating a moment of sympathy for her from the women in the crowd. So let's get this straight. The woman famous for a line she never said, "Let them eat cake," had a final moment that was the complete opposite of that caricature. Marie Antoinette's journey to the end was brutal. After the storming of the Tuileries Palace, her family was imprisoned. She went from being the Queen of France, a fashion icon whose every whim was catered to prisoner number 280 in the Conciergerie prison. It was a damp, dark cell. She was watched around the clock by guards. Her health failed. Her hair, once elaborately coiffed and powdered, had reportedly turned white from the stress. On the morning of October 16, 1793, they came for her. They cut her hair short crudely to prepare for the blade. They dressed her not in royal finery, but in a simple white dress, the kind worn by widows and the condemned. Unlike her husband, who was granted a closed carriage for his final journey, she was forced into an open cart, a tumbril. For over an hour she was paraded through the streets of Paris, past crowds that screamed insults and spat at her. Throughout it all, witnesses said she remained impassive, her face a mask of dignity. Or maybe it was just numbness. She arrived at the Place de la Revolution, now the Place de la Concorde. The guillotine stood waiting. It was a massive, intimidating structure. The crowd was huge. Thousands of people packed in to see the end of the Austrian she-wolf. She climbed the wooden steps of the scaffold. She was 37 years old. As she moved toward the platform, she accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner, Charles Henri Sanson. And this is where the myth of the heartless queen shatters. She paused, looked at the man who was about to end her life, and said her last recorded words. "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur. Je ne l'ai pas fait exprès. Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it. Think about that." Her final sentence was not a plea for her life, not a curse on the revolution, not a declaration of innocence. It was a simple, polite apology, an ingrained piece of etiquette from a life of royal protocol emerging in the most surreal and terrifying moment imaginable. It was a flash of the woman, the person, not the political symbol. For a brief second, she wasn't the hated foreign queen. She was just someone who had clumsily trodden on another's foot and felt the need to apologize. Sanson himself was a professional from a long line of executioners. He was not a revolutionary zealot, but a man doing a job. Perhaps her quiet humanity in that moment even struck him. We will never know. Moments later, it was over. The man showed her head to the crowd, which erupted in cheers. Her body was taken to a common grave. It was a grim end to a life that had once been the pinnacle of European glamour and power, but her last words linger. They are not powerful or defiant. They are small, human, and utterly unforgettable. Number 18, what does a queen say when she has nothing left to give? Elizabeth, I owned over 2,000 pairs of gloves. She never married, styling herself as the Virgin Queen, married to her country, England. Her teeth were notoriously bad, blackened by her love for sugar, which was a new and expensive luxury at the time. She survived a bout of smallpox in 1562 that left her with facial scars, which she covered with heavy white makeup made from vinegar and white lead, a toxic concoction. The end for Queen Elizabeth was not a sharp, sudden event like an execution. It was a slow, stubborn fade. By By March 1603, she was nearly 70 years old, an ancient age for the time. She had ruled England for 44 years. She had defeated the Spanish Armada, navigated treacherous political waters, and overseen a golden age of culture. But now, she was exhausted. She was consumed by a deep melancholy, possibly triggered by the death of her close friend, the Countess of Nottingham. She refused to go to bed. For weeks, she stood or sat on cushions piled on the floor, propped up by her ladies in waiting. She believed that if she lay down, she would never get up again. She refused food. She refused medicine. Her doctors were helpless. Her counselors, led by Robert Cecil, were desperate. The kingdom needed a named successor. Elizabeth had always refused to name one, fearing it would make her a target. Now, with the Queen fading, the country was on the brink of a succession crisis. They begged her to rest. They pleaded with her to name an heir. For days she remained silent, sometimes holding a finger in her mouth, a sign of her deep distress. Her mind, once the sharpest political instrument in Europe, was clouded. Finally, her counselors grew bold. They needed an answer. They pressed her, asking her to confirm that James VI of Scotland, the son of her old rival Mary, Queen of Scots, would be the one to succeed her. She was too weak to speak. The story goes that she made a gesture, a circle around her head with her hand, to indicate a crown and to signify her consent. But her last actual spoken words were more primal, more elemental. According to one of her ladies-in-waiting, Lady Southwell, as Elizabeth lay dying, surrounded by the wealth and power she had accumulated over a lifetime, she whispered, "All my possessions for a moment of time." It's a line of pure poetry. The woman who had everything, palaces, jewels, a kingdom, understood at the end that none of it mattered. The one thing she couldn't buy, command or conquer, was time. She, who had been the master of her own destiny and the destiny of a nation, was now powerless against the simple, inexorable passage of minutes and seconds. It was a final, profound realization from a monarch who had seemed larger than life. She had controlled so much, but in the end, she was just like everyone else, wishing for a little more time. She finally passed away in the early hours of March 24th, 1603. The Tudor dynasty died with her. Her last words serve as a stark reminder of the ultimate limitation of power. Number 17, can you forgive your executioner? Anne Boleyn had a vestigial sixth finger on one of her hands, a minor physical abnormality that her enemies later tried to use as evidence she was a witch. She spent part of her youth in the French court, which was known for its sophistication, and she brought that style and wit back to England, completely captivating Henry Vede. The Pope's refusal to grant Henry an annulment from Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne was the direct cause of the English Reformation, a seismic shift in history. Anne Boleyn's fall was as swift and spectacular as her rise. For years she was the object of a king's obsession. He broke with the Catholic Church for her. He made her a queen. But when she failed to produce a male heir, giving him only a daughter, the future Elizabeth I, his infatuation soured into deadly impatience. In less than 3 years of marriage, she went from his cherished love to a prisoner in the Tower of London. The charges against her were a collection of lies, adultery, incest, and treason. They were designed to do one thing, get her out of the way, so Henry could marry Jane Seymour. Her trial was a foregone conclusion. On May 19, 1536, she was led to a private execution on Tower Green. Public executions were messy, chaotic affairs. Henry afforded her this small mercy of privacy with only about 1,000 spectators present. He also, in another supposed act of kindness, hired a specialist executioner from France. This man used a sword, not the clumsy English executioner's axe. A sword was said to be quicker and more humane. Anne climbed the scaffold. She was dressed in a gray damask gown with a red kirtle underneath. She was not hysterical or broken. Accounts from the time describe her as calm and composed. She turned to the crowd and gave a short, carefully worded speech. She didn't protest her innocence. To do so would have been pointless and could have endangered her daughter, Elizabeth. Instead, she was conciliatory. She praised King Henry, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord. It was a piece of political theater, a final act of submission to protect her child's future. Then she knelt down. The ladies in waiting removed her headdress and tied a blindfold over her eyes. She kept repeating a prayer. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul, Lord Jesus, receive my soul. The French swordsman, to distract her and ensure a clean cut, reportedly called out, "Where is my sword?" As she perhaps turned her head slightly toward the sound, he struck. Her final repeated words were a prayer, a simple direct appeal to her God. In the face of political betrayal and brutal injustice, her last thoughts were not of revenge or anger, but of the fate of her own soul. It showed a deep piety that many of her critics denied she possessed. She met her end not as a hysterical victim, but as a queen who, even in her final moments, managed her own death with a strange and haunting grace. Her last prayer was her ultimate mic drop, a complete turning away from the corrupt world of men and kings toward a higher authority. Number 16, can a mother's love outlast a king's cruelty? Catherine of Aragon was Queen of England for 24 years, far longer than all of Henry V's other 5 wives combined. She was a skilled military leader. While Henry was away fighting in France in 1513, she served as regent and oversaw the English army's decisive victory against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. She was a great patron of education and a deeply devout Catholic, a fact that would define her later life and the course of English history. Catherine of Aragon's end was a story of profound isolation and unwavering principle. After 2 decades as a beloved queen, she found herself in an impossible position. She had failed to give Henry V a son, and he had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. Henry sought an annulment, claiming their marriage was invalid because Catherine had been his brother's wife first. Catherine fought this with every fiber of her being. For her, it was not just about her title or her position. It was about the legitimacy of her daughter Mary and the sanctity of her marriage vows before God. The king did not care. He broke with Rome, established the Church of England, and had his marriage to Catherine declared null and void. She was stripped of her title, no longer Queen of England, but downgraded to Dowager Princess of Wales. She was separated from her daughter Mary, and they were forbidden from seeing each other. This was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. Catherine was exiled from court and moved from one dreary, isolated castle to another. Her health began to fail. She ended up at Kimbolton Castle, a cold and damp place. Her servants were dismissed, her comforts removed. She was, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner, yet she never accepted her new status. To the end, she referred to herself as the Queen of England and demanded her servants do the same. In early January 1536, it became clear she was dying, likely from a form of cancer. She was just 50 years old. Knowing the end was near, she dictated a final letter to King Henry. It is a document of incredible strength, sadness, and grace. She addresses him as my most dear lord, king, and husband. She forgives him for the troubles he has plunged her into. She asks him to be a good father to their daughter, Mary, and then she delivers her last heartbreaking line. Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things. After everything he had done to her, the public humiliation, the exile, the separation from her child, her final written words professed her enduring love and loyalty. Was it a true declaration of love or a final, masterful political move to secure her daughter's safety? It's likely a bit of both, but the raw emotion is undeniable. Here was a woman, abandoned and dying, whose final thoughts were of the man who had caused her so much pain. It's a testament to her unshakable character and the complex, tragic nature of her relationship with Henry. She died on January 7th, 1536. When her body was embalmed, it was discovered that her heart was blackened, leading to rumors she had been poisoned. The more likely medical explanation is that it was the result of her illness, but the symbolism was potent. She died, many believed, of a broken heart. Number 15, what if your last word was simply a name? And Queen Victoria survived at least 7 assassination attempts during her reign. She was the first reigning British monarch to use a train. She proposed to her husband, Prince Albert, not the other way around, which was highly unusual for the era. After Albert's death in 1861, she wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life, entering a state of permanent mourning that profoundly shaped the public image of the monarchy. Victoria's death, unlike those of many queens before her, was peaceful. She died of old age, surrounded by her family. But the circumstances of her passing were just as controlled and significant as any grand state affair. She died on January 22nd, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She was 81 and had ruled for over 63 years, a reign so long it defined an entire era. In her final days, her health had been declining rapidly. She had suffered a series of small strokes. She was surrounded by her children and grandchildren, a vast web of European royalty that she had personally created through strategic marriages. Her son and heir, the future King Edward VII, was there. So was her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. The future of Europe was literally gathered in that room. Victoria, a woman known for her iron will and meticulous planning, had left detailed instructions for her own funeral. She wanted a military funeral as a soldier's daughter. She wanted to be buried in a white dress and her wedding veil, not the black she had worn for 4 decades. She also had a list of specific mementos to be placed in her coffin with her, including a plaster cast of Prince Albert's hand and a photograph of her controversial Scottish servant, John Brown. As she lay in her bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, her family kept a vigil. Her doctor noted her final moments. Her breathing grew shallow. It was a quiet, solemn scene. And then, her last reported word was whispered, "Bertie." Bertie was the family nickname for her eldest son, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, who had spent his entire life, nearly 60 years, waiting to become king. Their relationship had been notoriously difficult. Victoria often blamed Bertie's youthful indiscretions for contributing to the stress that she believed led to his father, Prince Albert's, early death. She had often treated him with disdain, considering him frivolous and ill-suited to rule. She excluded him from state affairs for decades. So for her very last word to be his name is incredibly poignant. Was it a final plea, a moment of reconciliation, an acknowledgement of the transition of power that was about to happen, or simply the mind of a dying mother calling for her son? We can't know for sure, but in that single word, a lifetime of maternal conflict, disappointment, and perhaps, in the end, love was contained. It was a deeply personal end for a very public figure. Moments after she spoke his name, she was gone. The Victorian era was over. Number 14, How Do You Reign for Only 9 Days? Lady Jane Grey was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII and a first cousin once removed of King Edward VI. She was one of the most educated women of her time, fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Italian. Her claim to the throne was engineered by the powerful Duke of Northumberland, who was also her father-in-law. He married his son, Guildford Dudley, to Jane just 6 weeks before the king's death. The story of Lady Jane Grey is one of the great tragedies of English history. She was a pawn in a massive political power play. She never wanted to be queen. When King Edward VI, Henry V's only son, died at the age of 15 in 1553, he left behind a Protestant country. His half-sister, Mary, was next in line, but she was a devout Catholic. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland and Edward's chief minister, knew Mary's accession would mean the end of his power and the reversal of the English Reformation. So, he concocted a plan. He had the dying king sign a document naming his Protestant cousin Jane as his successor, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth. And Jane was a teenager, probably around 16 or 17. When they came to tell her she was queen, she reportedly fainted. She accepted the crown with extreme reluctance, crying and saying she was not fit for it. She was queen for just 9 days. The English people did not support this blatant power grab. Their loyalty was to the Tudor line. Support for Mary swelled, and she marched on London with an army. Northumberland's support collapsed. Jane and her husband were arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. At first, Mary was inclined to be merciful. Jane was, after all, her young cousin and a clear victim of political ambition. But a few months later, a Protestant rebellion broke out in Jane's name, though without her involvement. Mary's advisors convinced her that, as long as Jane was alive, she would be a magnet for rebellion. Mary reluctantly signed her death warrant. On February 12, 1554, a cold winter morning, Jane was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. Her husband had been executed on Tower Hill just before her. She watched his body being carried away in a cart. On the scaffold, she was composed. She made a speech, admitting she had consented to the thing I was enforced unto. She recited Psalm 51 in English. Then they put a blindfold on her. In a moment of panic, she couldn't find the executioner's block. What shall I do? Where is it?" she cried out. Someone helped guide her hands to it. She laid her head down on the block. Her final words were a direct quote from the Bible, the same words Jesus spoke on the cross. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." It was the ultimate statement of her Protestant faith. She wasn't appealing to saints or to the Virgin Mary, but directly to God. For a young woman whose life was destroyed by a religious and political conflict she didn't choose, her final words were a quiet, powerful declaration of where her true allegiance lay. It was not with ambitious dukes or fickle crowns, but with her faith. Her death cemented her legacy as a Protestant martyr, the 9-day queen who met her end with a piety and courage that belied her years. Number 13. What happens when an empress doesn't know she's dying? Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, had a 20-inch waist and maintained it through extreme dieting and exercise. She had a floor-length mane of chestnut hair that took several hours a day to care for. The weight of her elaborate hairstyles often gave her headaches. She had a small anchor tattooed on her shoulder, a shocking act for a 19th century royal. She spent most of her time away from the Viennese court, which she despised, traveling restlessly across Europe. Empress Sisi was a woman who felt trapped her entire life. She was married to Emperor Franz Joseph I at 16 and thrust into the rigid, suffocating world of the Habsburg court. She was famous for her beauty, but she was also deeply unhappy, suffering from what we would now likely call depression and an eating disorder. She used her constant travels as an escape. In September 1898, she was in Geneva, Switzerland, traveling incognito under a pseudonym, as she often did. She was 60 years old. On the afternoon of September 10th, she was walking with her lady-in-waiting, Countess Irma Starai, along the shore of Lake Geneva. They were heading to a steamship that would take them to their next destination. As they walked, a young man ran towards them. It was an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. He had come to Geneva with the intent to assassinate a prince, but his target had already left. Lucchini, determined to kill a royal, any royal, to make a political statement, saw in the newspaper that the Empress of Austria was in town. He chose her as his new target. He ran up to Sisi and appeared to stumble, punching her in the chest. It seemed like a minor scuffle. The Empress fell to the ground. The people who rushed to help thought she had simply fainted from the shock, while her lady-in-waiting helped her up. Sisi, ever conscious of her schedule, was primarily concerned with being on time for the boat. She adjusted her hair, picked up her fan, and they continued walking the short distance to the ship. Once aboard, she collapsed. Her lady-in-waiting, thinking it was another fainting spell, opened her bodice to help her breathe. It was only then that she saw a small dark stain on Sisi's camise. Lucchini hadn't punched her. He had stabbed her with a stiletto, a thin, sharp dagger. The weapon was so slender and the wound so small that it had barely bled externally. Sisi's incredibly tight corset had acted like a pressure bandage, stanching the flow of blood and delaying the inevitable. She briefly regained consciousness. Her lady-in-waiting leaned in close. The Empress looked at her with confusion and asked her final question. "What happened to me?" Then she lost consciousness for the last time. They carried her back to the hotel where she died shortly after. Her final words were not a profound statement or a prayer. They were a question, a moment of pure human confusion. She didn't even realize she had been fatally wounded. It's a hauntingly mundane end for such a glamorous and tormented figure. She died without understanding why, a final, tragic reflection of a life in which she often felt bewildered and out of place. The anarchist who killed her wanted to be famous for his act. He got his wish, but Sisi's last words, in their simple, tragic bewilderment, are what truly endure. Number 12, can you command your own death? Maria Theresa was the only female ruler of the Habsburg dominions, and she ruled for 40 years. She had 16 children, 10 of whom survived to adulthood. One of her daughters was Marie Antoinette. She implemented major reforms in education and the military, and she centralized the power of the state, making her one of the most successful and powerful rulers of the 18th century. Despite her power, she was a loving and famously devoted wife to her husband. Francis I. Maria Theresa was a force of nature. She was pragmatic, pious, and possessed an indomitable will. She had navigated wars, political intrigue, and the immense challenge of being a woman in a position of supreme power. By November 1780, she was 63 years old. She was overweight, suffered from shortness of breath, and her health was failing. She knew the end was near, and she decided to face it head-on, with the same control and determination she had shown throughout her life. She took to her bed in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. Her son and co-ruler Joseph II was with her. Their relationship was often stormy, and Joseph was a radical reformer, an Enlightenment thinker, while Maria Theresa was a staunch conservative and devout Catholic. They clashed frequently over policy, but in her final days he was a devoted son. As her condition worsened, she remained lucid and in command. She gave final instructions, sorted her affairs, and prepared herself spiritually. She refused to simply let death happen to her. She was going to actively participate in the process. At one point, her son, seeing her sitting up in a chair in discomfort, urged her to lie down and try to sleep. He told her, "You are not comfortable." She looked at him with her characteristic firmness. "I find I can die quite comfortably sitting up," she replied. Later, as her family worried she was drifting into unconsciousness, she roused herself to reassure them. Her doctor tried to tell her she was just sleeping, to calm her. She corrected him with her final words. "I am not asleep," she said. "I am preparing to die. I am now on my way to God, and I will let nothing hold me back." Some accounts phrase it more simply, "I am preparing to die." Either way, the sentiment is the same. It is a statement of incredible strength and acceptance. There was no fear, no pleading for more time. For Maria Theresa, dying was the final great duty of her life, and she intended to perform it with the same sense of purpose that she had brought to everything else. She saw it not as a passive event, but as an active journey. Her last words were not a surrender, but a declaration of intent. She was in charge, even of her own departure from the world. She died on November 29th, 1780. Her final moments were a perfect encapsulation of her entire reign, powerful, deliberate, and utterly resolute. Number 11. Does death reveal your one true love? Josephine de Beauharnais was 6 years older than Napoleon Bonaparte. She was a widow with 2 children when they met. Napoleon was so infatuated with her that he wrote her passionate, often desperate love letters from his military campaigns. She nearly missed her own coronation as Empress of France in 1804 because she was arguing with Napoleon over his infidelities. Josephine's life was a whirlwind. She was born on the island of Martinique, survived the French Revolution's reign of terror. Her first husband was guillotined, and then captured the heart of the most powerful man in Europe. Theirs was a passionate, turbulent relationship. Napoleon loved her deeply, but he was also obsessed with founding a dynasty. Josephine, unable to give him an heir, was in a precarious position. In 1809, Napoleon made the difficult decision to divorce her. It was a political necessity for him, but a personal devastation for her. The scene of their divorce was reportedly heartbreaking, with both of them weeping. Even after he married the Austrian princess Marie Louise, who gave him a son, Napoleon remained deeply attached to Josephine. He ensured she retained the title of Empress, provided her with a massive income, and visited her at her home, the Château de Malmaison. Josephine lived out her post-divorce years at Malmaison, creating magnificent gardens that became famous throughout Europe. But she followed Napoleon's career obsessively. She rejoiced in his victories and was crushed by his defeats. When Paris fell to Allied forces in 1814, and Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, she was devastated. She even wrote to him offering to join him in exile, but he never received the letter. In May of that year, she caught a cold after going for a walk in the gardens with the Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, who had come to pay his respects. The cold quickly developed into pneumonia. Her health declined rapidly. On the morning of May 29, 1814, she was lying in her bed at Malmaison, surrounded by her children. She was only 50 years old. As she drifted towards death, she began to murmur. Her last words were a fragmented whisper, a summary of the great loves and losses of her life. Bonaparte, Elba, the King of Rome. Bonaparte, the name of the man who had lifted her to unimaginable heights and then cast her aside. Elba, the island of his first exile, a symbol of his downfall and her own sorrow, and the King of Rome, the title given to Napoleon's son by his second wife, the heir that Josephine herself could never provide. Her last thoughts were not of her own children, who were right there in the room, but of the man and the dynasty that had defined and ultimately broken her heart. It was a final, poignant testament to the depth of her obsession and her enduring love for the emperor who had been the center of her universe. Even in death, she could not escape him. Number 10, can last words be a final act of defiance? Mary, Queen of Scots, became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old. She spent her childhood in France and was briefly Queen Consort of France. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, towering over most men and women of her time, including her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, whom she never met in person. After being forced to abdicate the Scottish throne, she fled to England seeking protection from Elizabeth, but was instead imprisoned for the next 18.5 years. The end for Mary, Queen of Scots, was a meticulously staged piece of political theater, and she was determined to play her part perfectly. After nearly 2 decades of imprisonment, she was implicated in the Babington Plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Queen Elizabeth. She was tried and found guilty of treason. Elizabeth, after much hesitation, signed the death warrant. On the morning of February 8th, 1587, Mary was led to her execution in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle. She did not go as a condemned criminal, but as a queen and a Catholic martyr. She had planned her outfit with immense care. She wore a dress of black satin, but underneath she wore a kirtle and petticoat of deep crimson, the liturgical color of Catholic martyrdom. She walked to the scaffold with regal composure. She gave a speech declaring her innocence in the plot against Elizabeth and affirming that she was dying a true Catholic. The English nobles present tried to get her to pray with the Protestant Dean of Peterborough, but she refused. "I will have nothing to do with you, nor with your doctrine," she told him. She prayed aloud in Latin, and then her ladies-in-waiting helped her remove her black outer gown, revealing the startling crimson underneath. It was a shocking, dramatic reveal, a final, visual act of defiance. The executioners knelt and asked for her forgiveness, as was custom. "I forgive you with all my heart," she replied, "for now, I hope, you shall make an end of all my troubles." Her ladies blindfolded her with a white cloth embroidered with gold. She knelt at the block, positioning her head. She then spoke her last words, a Latin phrase from the liturgy, "In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum." "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." It took the executioner 2 blows with the axe to sever her head. When he finally lifted it to show the crowd shouting, "God save the Queen," her head fell from his grasp, leaving him holding only her red wig. Her own hair was short and gray. It was a final, grim surprise in a life full of them. Her last words, a prayer of surrender to God, were the ultimate rejection of the earthly authority that had condemned her. She died not as a failed Queen of Scotland or a convicted traitor, but in her own eyes and the eyes of Catholic Europe, as a martyr for her faith. Number 9. What does a warrior queen say in defeat? Boudica, the queen of the Iceni tribe in Roman-occupied Britain, was likely not her real name. Boudica derives from a Celtic word meaning victory. So she was, in effect, Queen Victory. The main historical accounts of her rebellion come from 2 Roman historians, Tacitus and Cassius Dio, who were writing decades after the events and had a clear pro-Roman bias. According to Cassius Dio, she was very tall, with long red hair, a harsh voice, and a piercing gaze. Boudica's story is not one of a quiet deathbed, but of a fiery rebellion and a defiant end. Around 60 or 61 AD, her husband Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni, died. He had tried to protect his people by making the Roman emperor co-heir to his kingdom, along with his 2 daughters. He hoped this would buy them Roman goodwill. He was wrong. Roman officials ignored the will, they seized the kingdom, flogged Boudica publicly, and assaulted her daughters. It was a brutal and humiliating act, designed to crush the spirit of the Iceni. It did the opposite. It ignited a firestorm. Boudica, enraged and seeking vengeance, rallied her people and other British tribes. She led a massive army against the Romans. Her rebellion was terrifyingly successful at first. Her forces sacked and burned three major Roman settlements: Camulodunum Colchester, Londinium London, and Verulamium St. Albans. They destroyed a Roman legion. Roman historians describe scenes of utter devastation. Tens of thousands of Romans and Romanized Britons were killed. But the Roman army was a professional fighting machine. The governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus gathered his legions and confronted Boudicca's massive but less disciplined tribal army at a location we no longer know, somewhere along the Roman road known as Watling Street. Before the final battle, according to the historian Tacitus, Boudicca drove among her troops in a chariot with her daughters. She gave a rousing speech. She told them she was not fighting for her lost wealth, but as an ordinary person, fighting for her lost freedom, her bruised body, and the honor of her daughters. She declared that it was a day for victory or death. "This is a woman's resolve," she supposedly said. As for men, they may live and be slaves. The battle was a disaster for the Britons. The superior tactics and weaponry of the Roman legions crushed the rebellion. The Britons were slaughtered. Tacitus claims that 80,000 Britons died, with only 400 Roman casualties. This is almost certainly an exaggeration, but the defeat was total. Boudicca's actual last words are not recorded. But her last reported act is facing capture, humiliation, and being paraded in a Roman triumph. She chose her own end. Tacitus writes simply that she ended her life with poison. Her final, unrecorded words were superseded by her final action, an ultimate act of defiance, choosing death over slavery. Her pre-battle speech serves as her last testament, a powerful cry for freedom that has echoed through British history for 2 millennia. She refused to let her enemies write the final chapter of her story. Number 8. How does a scholar face the end? Christina of Sweden refused to marry, famously stating she had an insurmountable distaste for marriage. She was a brilliant intellectual who corresponded with the philosopher René Descartes and invited him to her court in Stockholm. In a move that shocked 17th century Europe, she abdicated her throne in 1654, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome, where she became a major figure in the city's cultural life. Queen Christina was anything but conventional. She was raised like a prince, became queen at the age of 6, and ruled as a philosopher king. She was intelligent, headstrong, and utterly uninterested in the traditional roles of a female monarch. Her abdication and move to Rome were a sensation. She left behind her cold Protestant kingdom for the heart of the Catholic world, where she established a new court of artists, musicians, and intellectuals. She lived in Rome for over 30 years, a powerful and sometimes disruptive presence. She was a patron of the arts, but also involved herself in church and city politics, often to the frustration of the popes. She lived a life on her own terms, free from the constraints of the Swedish throne. By April 1689, she was in her early 60s, and her health was failing. She was suffering from a combination of ailments. As she lay dying in her Roman palace, she knew the end was approaching. She had lived a life defined by her intellect and her will. Her death would be no different. Her final words are debated by historians, but one powerful quote is often attributed to her, or at least to her spirit. The words were originally spoken by Pope Gregory 7 centuries earlier, but they perfectly encapsulate Christina's life. "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." Whether she said these exact words or not, they serve as a perfect epitaph. "I have loved justice and hated iniquity" speaks to her lifelong pursuit of knowledge, philosophy, and enlightened rule. She saw herself as a seeker of truth. "Therefore I die in exile" captures the central fact of her later life. She had willingly chosen exile from her homeland to pursue her intellectual and spiritual freedom. She died far from the kingdom she was born to rule in a city she had adopted as her own. Her death was a quiet end to a life of dramatic public choices. She died on April 19th, 1689. In a final remarkable twist for a queen who had abandoned her Protestant throne, she was given a grand funeral and buried in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, one of only a handful of women to be granted that honor. Her last sentiments, whether spoken or simply understood, were a final, proud justification for a life lived with extraordinary independence. Number 7, could a single question change a kingdom? Eleanor of Aquitaine was Queen of France, then Queen of England, and the mother of two English kings, Richard the Lionheart and King John. She was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Western Europe during the High Middle Ages. She participated in the Second Crusade, an incredible undertaking for a woman of her time. Later in life, after being imprisoned by her second husband, King Henry II, for 16 years, she re-emerged to essentially rule England while her son Richard was away on the Third Crusade. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived an astonishingly long and eventful life. She was born around 1122 and died in 1204, living well into her 80s, an almost unheard of age for the 12th century. She had outlived husbands, rivals, and most of her own children. She was a queen, a crusader, a prisoner, a regent, and a formidable political player to the very end. In her final years, she retired to Fontevraud Abbey in France, the resting place of her second husband, Henry II, and her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart. But even in retirement, she was not idle. She continued to advise her youngest son, King John, and worked to secure the Angevin Empire she had helped build. As she lay dying at Fontevraud, her life had come full circle. She was back in her native Aquitaine, the duchy she had inherited as a young girl, which had been the source of her immense power. She had seen kingdoms rise and fall. She had experienced passionate love and bitter betrayal. She had borne 10 children and buried 8 of them. There isn't a single snappy quote recorded as her last words. A life as long and complex as hers couldn't be summed up so easily. Instead, her final testament was her actions and her will. She had meticulously arranged her own affairs and those of the abbey. She ensured her legacy would be preserved. But one story, perhaps apocryphal but nonetheless powerful, captures the essence of her final thoughts. As she was dying, a priest or a monk at her bedside asked her a question that was central to the medieval mind: do you have faith in God? And Eleanor, a woman who had seen the heights of piety during the Crusades and the depths of human sin in the political courts of Europe, supposedly answered not with a simple yes, but with a question of her own. And if I did not, what then would there be for me? It's a response of profound depth. It's not a blind affirmation of faith, but the hard-won conclusion of a pragmatist. It suggests a lifetime of wrestling with belief, of seeing the world in all its beauty and brutality, and concluding that faith was the only logical anchor in a chaotic world. It was the question of a ruler, a strategist, who had weighed all the options and chosen her path. For a woman whose entire life was a series of calculated choices. Her faith, too, was a deliberate, considered position. It was a final, intelligent reflection from one of history's most remarkable women. Number 6, how do you secure a legacy from your deathbed? Isabella I of Castile personally financed Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 after he had been rejected by other European monarchs. She and her husband Ferdinand of Aragon were known as the Catholic monarchs, a title given to them by the Pope. She was a key figure in the Spanish Inquisition and the final phase of the Reconquista, which ended centuries of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula with the conquest of Granada. Isabella was not a figurehead. She was a shrewd and determined ruler who consolidated power, reformed the government, and laid the foundations for a unified Spain that would become a global superpower. She was a woman of intense piety and even more intense political will. In the autumn of 1504, her health was failing. She was in her early 50s, but worn out by a life of constant campaigning, political maneuvering, and personal grief, including the deaths of several of her children. As she lay dying, her primary concern was the future of the kingdom she had fought so hard to build. Her husband Ferdinand was king of Aragon, but she was the ruling queen of Castile. Her heir was their daughter Joanna, but Joanna's mental stability was already a cause for great concern. Isabella knew that her death could plunge the kingdom into a succession crisis, so she did what she had always done. She took control. From her deathbed, she dictated a meticulous and politically brilliant last will and testament. It was not a personal document full of sentimental farewells. It was a state paper, a final act of ruling. Her last words were not a single phrase, but this entire carefully constructed document. In it, she confirmed her daughter, Joanna, as her heir, but crucially, she appointed her husband Ferdinand as regent of Castile until her grandson, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, came of age. This was a masterstroke designed to ensure stability and prevent political rivals from taking advantage of Joanna's weakness. She also used her will to address the great projects of her reign. She urged her successors to continue the conversion of the native peoples of the newly discovered Americas, expressing a desire that they be treated humanely, a directive that was often ignored. She laid out instructions for her own burial, asking to be interred in Granada, the city whose conquest she saw as her greatest achievement. So, her mic drop moment was not a whisper, but a signed and sealed legal document that shaped the future of Spain. It was a final, powerful assertion of her authority. She was ruling from beyond the grave. She signed the will on October 12th and added a codicil just before her death on November 26th, 1504. Her last conscious acts were those of a queen, not a private individual. Her legacy was her kingdom, and her final words were its blueprint for survival. Number 5 was this well done. Cleopatra was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. She was not Egyptian, she was of Greek descent, a descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals. She was the first member of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language. She famously had love affairs and political alliances with two of Rome's most powerful men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Cleopatra's death is one of the most famous in all of history, a blend of tragedy, romance, and political calculation. After her and Mark Antony's forces were defeated by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, their world fell apart. Antony, hearing a false report of Cleopatra's death, took his own life. Cleopatra was captured by Octavian's forces in Alexandria. She was 39 years old. She knew what her fate would be. Octavian planned to take her back to Rome and parade her through the streets in his triumphal procession. For a proud queen who had ruled as a living goddess, this public humiliation was a fate worse than death. She was determined to control her own exit. She was held under guard in her mausoleum. According to the classical accounts, primarily from the historian Plutarch, she managed to have a basket of figs delivered to her. Hidden beneath the figs was an asp, a venomous snake associated with Egyptian royalty and divine power. The bite of an asp was believed to grant immortality. She dressed in her finest royal robes. She wrote a letter to Octavian asking to be buried next to Mark Antony. When Octavian's men received the letter and realized her intentions, they rushed to her rooms. They burst in to find a scene of silent, regal death. Cleopatra lay dead on her golden couch. One of her handmaidens, Iris, was dying at her feet. Another, Charmion, was stumbling, trying to adjust the diadem on Cleopatra's head. One of Octavian's guards, seeing the scene, angrily demanded, "Was this well done, Charmion?" Charmion, with her last breath, gave the iconic reply. "It was very well done," she said, "and fitting for a descendant of so many kings." And then she too fell dead. While these were the words of her handmaiden, they have become inseparable from Cleopatra's own story. They serve as her final statement. They frame her death not as a suicide of a defeated woman, but as a final triumphant act of a queen. It was a carefully staged performance designed to preserve her dignity and cheat her enemy of his ultimate prize. She chose the how and when of her death, ensuring she would be remembered not as a Roman captive, but as the last pharaoh of Egypt. Charmion's words are the perfect epitaph for that final defiant act of royal will. Number 4, what if your final words were a lie to save your family? Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was a carrier of the gene for hemophilia, which she passed on to her only son, the Tsarevich Alexei, a secret that deeply affected the family and the politics of the Russian court. She was deeply unpopular with the Russian people, who viewed her as a cold, German outsider and were suspicious of her close relationship with the mystic Grigory Rasputin. The end of the Romanov dynasty was not a single moment, but a long, brutal process that culminated in a cellar in Ekaterinburg on the night of July 17th, 1918. After Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in 1917, he, Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, were placed under house arrest. They were moved from place to place, their world shrinking until it was confined to a single building, the Ipatiev House, also known as the House of Special Purpose. They were prisoners of the Bolsheviks. In the early hours of that July morning, the family was woken up. They were told there was unrest in the town, and they needed to be moved to the basement for their own safety. The family, along with their doctor and 3 loyal servants, got dressed and went downstairs. They were led into a small, empty cellar room. There was a sense of confusion and unease. Chairs were brought for the Tsarina and the frail Alexei. Nicholas stood with his son. The daughters and the staff stood behind them. The commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, entered with a group of armed men. Yurovsky read a short statement declaring that they were to be executed. The Tsar was stunned. He reportedly turned to his family and said something like, "What? What?" before being shot. The room erupted in gunfire. In this chaotic and horrific moment, specific, verifiable last words are almost impossible to determine. But the final words spoken to the family by their captors were a deliberate deception. The command to go to the cellar was a lie. You need to move to the basement for your own safety. Those were the last instructions they ever received. They were words of false reassurance, a cruel trick to lead them calmly to their doom. They walked to their deaths believing they were being protected. This lie is, in a way, the last word in the story of their captivity. It represents the ultimate betrayal by the people who now held power over their lives. The reality was so unthinkable that the family, accustomed to a certain order, seemed to have followed the instructions without protest. Their final moments were defined not by a grand statement, but by a quiet, confused compliance to a lie. A final, grim testament to how completely their world had been turned upside down. Number 3, could a queen's last act be a quiet joke? Catherine the Great of Russia was a German princess who came to Russia to marry the heir, Peter III. She seized power from her unpopular husband in a coup d'etat in 1762, just months after he became Tsar. She ruled for 34 years, expanding the Russian Empire and presiding over a period of cultural flourishing known as the Russian Enlightenment. She was a prolific writer and corresponded with many of the great minds of the era, including Voltaire. Catherine the Great's death has been the subject of scandalous and completely false rumors for centuries. The most famous of these is a vile story that she died while engaging in an inappropriate act with a horse. This was a piece of slander, likely created by her political enemies to tarnish the legacy of a powerful and successful female ruler. The reality of her death was far more mundane, but it contained a moment of her characteristic wit. On the morning of November 16, 1796, Catherine, then 67 years old, woke up as usual in the Winter Palace. She followed her daily routine, which included drinking strong coffee and working on state papers. She then went to her dressing room. After an unusually long time, her attendants grew worried. When they entered the room, they found her on the floor, unconscious. She had suffered a massive stroke. They carried her to her bed. Her doctors were summoned, but it was clear there was nothing they could do. She was paralyzed and never regained consciousness. She lingered for another day, her breathing shallow, while her court gathered in a state of shock, and her estranged son, the future Tsar Paul I, rushed to her bedside. She died the following evening, so she had no true last words in the traditional sense, as she was unconscious. But the story of her last conscious moments contains a detail that reveals her personality. The day before her stroke, she was in good spirits. She was with her latest favorite, the much younger Platon Zubov. She reportedly turned to him and said, "Do you know, my friend, it occurs to me that I shall die very suddenly." He tried to reassure her, but she insisted. Then, according to some accounts, she made a wry comment to one of her ladies-in-waiting, perhaps about a new dress or a piece of furniture, saying something to the effect of, "Well, it will have to do for my successor." It was a small, almost throwaway line, but it was pure Catherine. It was pragmatic, slightly fatalistic, and tinged with a dark humor. She was a ruler who was always looking ahead, always planning. Even when contemplating her own death, her thoughts turned to the practical matter of succession and the continuation of the state. She faced the prospect of her own mortality not with fear or piety, but with a kind of dry, world-weary acceptance. It was a fittingly unsentimental end for one of history's most clear-eyed and powerful rulers. Number 2, how do you rule from a wheelchair? Zenobia, queen of the Palmyrene Empire in the 3rd century AD, carved out a massive territory for herself from the Roman Empire, controlling Egypt, Syria, and much of Asia Minor at its peak. She claimed descent from Cleopatra. She was highly educated, spoke several languages, and was known for her ability to march on foot with her soldiers for miles. Zenobia's story is one of incredible ambition and a dramatic fall. From her capital in the oasis city of Palmyra, she challenged the might of Rome. For a brief time, she was one of the most powerful rulers in the world. But the Roman Emperor Aurelian was not a man to be trifled with. He marched his legions east and, in a series of battles, defeated Zenobia's armies. Palmyra was besieged and captured in 272 AD. Zenobia's fate is one of history's great mysteries, with conflicting accounts from Roman historians. There is no single, universally accepted version of her end, and therefore no recorded last words. But the different stories about her fate each provide a different kind of last statement about her character. One version, the most tragic, says that Zenobia and her son starved themselves to death on the journey to Rome, or that she died of an illness, refusing to eat out of shame and despair. In this telling, her final act is one of pride and defiance, choosing death over humiliation. Another, more famous version, tells of her being brought to Rome for Aurelian's triumph in 274 AD. Unlike Cleopatra, she did not escape this fate. The accounts say she was paraded through the streets of Rome, bound in golden chains and laden with so many jewels that she could barely walk. She was the star attraction of the parade, a living symbol of Rome's restored power. In this version, her last public words are not spoken, but are a visual spectacle of defeat. But there is a third version, and it is perhaps the most interesting. This account claims that after the triumph, Aurelian, impressed by her courage, spared her life. He gave her a villa in Tivoli, near Rome, where she lived out her days as a Roman noblewoman. Her daughters reportedly married into prominent Roman families. In this version, Zenobia's last act is one of pragmatism and survival. She adapts, she trades her crown for a comfortable retirement. So, which is the real Zenobia? The defiant queen who chose death, the humiliated captive, or the pragmatic survivor? We will likely never know for sure. Her last words are lost to history, replaced by these competing narratives. Her mic drop is the mystery itself. Her story ends not with a sentence, but with a question mark, leaving us to wonder about the true nature of this remarkable warrior queen. Number 1, can a simple name be a final judgment? Lucrezia Borgia was the illegitimate daughter of Pope Alexander VI. She was married off 3 times for political purposes by her father and her ruthless brother, Cesare Borgia. Her family's name was so synonymous with corruption and treachery that she has been unfairly cast as a villainess and poisoner in popular culture, though most historians now believe she was primarily a pawn in her family's ambitions. In her final marriage as the Duchess of Ferrara, she became a respected and pious ruler and a great patron of the arts. Lucrezia Borgia's life was a journey from scandal to respectability. In her youth in Rome, she was at the center of the Borgia family's web of power and intrigue. Her first 2 marriages ended in annulment and the murder of her husband, respectively, both orchestrated by her family for political gain. But her 3rd marriage to Alfonso I d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, was a turning point. In Ferrara, she escaped the shadow of her family. She created a brilliant court, patronized artists like Titian, and was known for her piety and charity. She seemed to have found a measure of peace and purpose. She had several children with Alfonso and appeared to be a devoted wife and mother. In June 1519, at the age of 39, she gave birth to her 8th child. The birth was difficult and complications set in. She developed a fever and grew weaker by the day. It quickly became clear that she was dying. 10 days after the birth, knowing the end was near, she did something remarkable. She dictated a letter. It was not to her husband or her children, who were with her in Ferrara. It was to the Pope in Rome, Pope Leo X. The letter is a model of piety. She writes that she is approaching the end of her life, and as a Christian, she is preparing to meet God. She asks the Pope for his holy blessing. It is a calm, formal, and deeply religious document, but it is the signature, her final written words, that is so striking. She signed it, "Your Holiness's humble servant Lucrezia d'Este." She did not sign it Lucrezia Borgia. She signed with the name of her husband, the name of her respectable life in Ferrara. In her final conscious act, she chose her identity. She was not the daughter of a corrupt pope, or the sister of a notorious political operator. She was the Duchess of Ferrara. It was a deliberate final rejection of the scandalous Borgia name that had defined her youth. Her letter was her last statement. It was a quiet, dignified claim to the identity she had built for herself, far away from the sins of her father and brother. It was a final subtle mic drop, a declaration that she was, in the end, her own woman. She died on June 24th, 1519, 2 days after writing the letter. Her husband reportedly grieved her death for the rest of his life, a testament to the Duchess she had become.